There are few things in life that I love more than late Victorian fashion and badass women. So in my quest to discover what the typical Victorian badass might be wearing, I landed upon the idea of the Victorian equivalent of a 3-piece pinstripe suit, the first 2 pieces of which you may wish to visit if you have not yet. But here we have arrived at the third and final piece, the jacket. And in true 1890s fashion, it shall have sleeves. No, I don't just mean sleeves. I mean sleeves. Anyway, this jacket is going to be made of the same pinstripe suiting wool that I used in the first 2 parts, and it'll be lined with a black cotton silesia. Because I'm using a pre-made pattern, which includes half an inch of seam allowance, I'm going in with some chalk and drawing in the actual stitching line so I know exactly where to stitch. This is an unnecessary step if you're working with a modern sewing machine that has a measuring gauge right on the machine, but my antique machine doesn't, so I'll need to have a stitching line to guide me. And one more layer, all of these jacket panels are going to be interlined with a layer of horsehair canvas for additional shaping assistance. The front dart, which I carefully traced onto the front and front-facing pieces, can be cut away entirely on this in-between layer to reduce bulk. First things first is to sew up the front darts so that I can start interlining these pieces and working the shape into them. On the outside fabric pieces, I can just sew these by machine and press them flat, but on the canvas pieces, where the dart's been cut away without seam allowance, I'm just lightly cross-stitching these edges together to hold them in place. Then I can baste the canvas pieces to the outer fabric for temporary holding until I can go in with the finer permanent stitching. I've also basted the canvas interlining to the other jacket panels, which are much more straightforward since only the front pieces have that extra dart step. Now for probably my favorite part of jacket tailoring, shaping the front pieces. I'm cutting another piece out of the canvas that's the shape of the upper portion of the pattern piece, from just below the bust line up to around about the shoulder area. This has the horsehair grain running horizontally across the body, so this is just going to help to keep that front chest area sitting super smooth and nice and round across the body to avoid some of that shoulder collapsing. This is a technique that is used in traditional tailoring for both men's and women's garments, but for women's garments, you'll want to cut a little slit down at the bottom where it overlaps with the dart seam, and allow these 2 sides to overlap slightly as much as they need to in order to conform smoothly to that curve. This then gets pad stitched into place with a very small, regular stitch, working the garment into that final curved shape as you go so that it wants to stay that way permanently. I'm starting from the middle and working my way out to ensure that this piece doesn't slowly shift anywhere as I work, and I'm only putting the needle through to catch the canvas layer underneath so that the stitches don't show through to the outside of the jacket. Whilst we are in a pad stitching mood, let us shape the lapel. In order to get the fabric to want to fold back nicely, as a lapel should want to do, we're just going to have to work that shaping into the textile itself. I'm doing this by wrapping the fabric around my index finger along the roll line of the lapel and pad stitching my way out, adjusting my finger as I go so that my line of stitching is always being done along that bend. I just love pad stitching interlinings so much. Seeing the shape slowly emerge is just so satisfying. Magic. I can then trim off the seam allowance along the front edge of the canvas layer so there's less bulk in the finished edge. We don't want to cut these canvas pieces net, that is without seam allowance initially, because some of that seam allowance will be drawn back into the main pattern shape when we work that curve into the lapel. This is because surface area of curves and stuff. But now that that's all finished and the final finished shape of the canvas is determined, we don't need any of the rest of that. And to finish off these fronts, I am whip stitching a row of linen stay tape along those center front and lapel edges and along the roll line. This just gives everything a bit of firm structure. Ladies and gentlefolk, we have completed jacket fronts. I mean, just look at the amount of structure that is just inherently built in to these pieces. Like this lapel, I mean, it just wants to behave. Isn't this not the most satisfying thing you have ever laid thine eyes upon? You cannot show me anything more beautiful than this. Just kidding, these fronts aren't actually done yet because I'm now just cross-stitching some lengths of boning into the dart seam. This was extremely common in Victorian jackets and bodices just to give that quintessential smooth-fronted corsety shape. All in all, these front pieces took around 3 days to prep fully in case you were wanting a time reference, but I find this to be the most enjoyable part of the process, so I enjoyed every minute of it. And now we are sufficiently finished with the prep and can put all of the pieces together. The front pieces, the front-facing pieces to finish off those front edges, and the lining, which I'm not sewing into the garment yet, I'm just putting the lining pieces together so that it's ready to go for later. And of course I am also stitching up the sleeves, so once again those will be ready for inserting later. One thing that I'm particularly drawn to in late Victorian fashion, and why I think it's such a great historical period for badassery in particular, is that we really start to see the rise of a new class of working professional women, and the dress of course that comes along with that. We're starting to see more women in jobs that aren't either domestic or noble. Women are not only therefore aiming for practicality in their dress or a new form of practicality because they are doing a new form of activity, but they're also now having to fit into often still heavily male-dominated offices. So as a result of this, as well as the rise of mass manufacture in clothing and an increase in the availability of ready-to-wear clothing, we see an increase in women adopting shirtwaists, unsupported skirts, and tailor-mades like jackets and waistcoats, which were previously mostly relegated to men's fashion, with the occasional exception of riding attire for women, which has taken after men's tailoring at least since the 16th century. These were a now increasingly acceptable alternative to full dresses or skirt and bodice sets, and the wages earned independently by this working professional woman meant that she would be able to buy these items herself ready-made. Don't get me wrong, we can't pretend that there wasn't still rampant misogyny and mistreatment of women in the workplace during this period, but I do see a huge leap forward in women's independence during this particular period in comparison with previous historical periods, and the ways that this is reflected in dress styles is particularly fascinating to me. All of this is to say, with the new availability of roles that women are now able to take on in the professional workplace, along with the popular literature and entertainment of the period increasingly featuring heroines working as detectives or journalists, I believe there is absolutely room to take this a step further and propose the concept of women in mob bossery. Anyway, now that we are all sewn and pressed and we have the vague beginnings of a garment, I'm going through and running a row of top stitching all along the front and lapel edges, partly as a decorative feature and partly to make sure that those edges stay perfectly flat. This is traditionally done in tailoring by hand, so likewise I am doing this by hand with a back stitch because I just think that looks nice, but running stitches are also super common for this. What we're looking at right now is not the jacket that I'm constructing. This is an extant jacket from probably about the late 1880s. And I wanted to have a look at this just to see what the boning configuration is on here, because this will inform my boning strategy for my jacket. So we have no bone in the center back, no bones in the side back seams. There's a bone here approximately at the side seam, and this bone has just been, as you can see, very, very loosely and quickly running stitched into the seam allowance, which is interesting. So there's no bone casing here, it's just, we're gonna use what we have and make it work. There is no bone at the side front seam, and there is a bone at the front just here. There are no bones at the darts. My plan for my jacket, hang on, let me pack her up and get her off the table so we can discuss. This jacket actually does not fasten, so I don't think that I strictly need a bone at the front here, especially because I've already put a bone at the dart here, which is also a common placing for bones in things at this period. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to put in one bone here from the waist up to about 1 inch from the top of the arm's eye. Go away. The boning material that I have is very narrow, so I think this actually should work. Let's give this a go. Now, we've put it off long enough, but it is time at last for sleeves. I'm making this way more dramatic than it needs to be. The 1890s are notorious for their large sleeve game, and fittingly, this jacket also has enormously puffy sleeves, which are much more forgiving in the fitting department than naturally fitting sleeves, so this shouldn't actually be too grievous a challenge. In fact, it wasn't too grievous a challenge. I'm first running a small gathering thread all along my sleeve heads on both the outer sleeve pieces as well as both sleeve linings. This is just a super quick gathering stitch, which is basically a running stitch, except for the stitch taken up by the needle is around half the length of the amount passed over between the stitches. But otherwise, no knots, no anchoring, since we want the fabric to be able to gather up smoothly when we pin the sleeves into the sleeve hole. The lining pieces are stuffed into the sleeve, and then I'm just tucking in the raw edges of the cuff so that I can fell these down by hand. And the sleeve seam itself is secured down with a strong backstitch in thick silk buttonhole twist for extra strength. Can you tell I avoid going near sleeves with a sewing machine at all costs? This is entirely a personal choice, but I find that I have more control over these particularly fiddly seams when working with them by hand, and doing them by machine, for me, in my case, will result in my having to unpick several sections where I've accidentally sewn some other part of the garment into the arm's eye, so, you know, you do you. Last, and actually, yeah, this was probably my least favorite part of the process, the lining. This is carefully aligned with the outer jacket seams, pinning profusely to make sure everything stayed in place. If a bit of the lining is accidentally pulled too tight or made a little bit smaller than the outer layer, then weird pulling things can start happening to the front, and the fit can feel off, putting all of your hard seaming and fitting work on the outer layer, completely to waste. So this is a stupid, fiddly, and time-consuming process, not even in a fun way like the days that I very happily spent on the jacket fronts, but it's a necessary part of the process, and it did eventually get done. I put this in the period way, of course, which is different from the common modern method of sewing in linings, where the two layers are sewn together inside out and then flipped right side out. Instead, after laying everything out accordingly, I just tuck in the raw edges and then fell everything down by hand. This part I don't actually mind, it's just the initial making sure you don't ruin the whole garment bit that I find mildly annoying. I think I spent about 2, maybe 2.5 days doing this step. And with one final press, the jacket is ready for action. I think there is nothing that I love more than a good tailoring project. Sewing as a craft very often gets the, in my opinion, largely incorrect association with this sort of floofy, delicate, feminine little craft that is just a thing that you do like a Jane Austen character with your little needlework sitting on the sofa and painting or whatever. But a lot of sewing, and especially tailoring, is actually, I mean, it's basically engineering. It is sculpture, it is bringing two-dimensional shapes into a three-dimensional garment that moves and that expresses so much character. There's so much magic in the process of bringing clothing to life and to build something that either creates an entirely different shape from the shape that exists, or to create a shape entirely altogether where there was no shape even to begin with. So it is definitely worth the effort. Now, you may be wondering, where'd you go, Bernadette? That, my clever detective friend, is for you to find out, because today's video is brought to you by June's Journey, the free-to-download mystery game that has been taking up a substantial part of my screen time lately. Set in 1920s New York, the story is told via the medium of a hidden objects game, so you can participate in the case by hunting for clues in each scene. The artwork is so soothing and gorgeous to look at, but as is the nature of a story that constantly keeps you on your toes, things aren't always as they seem. As you play, though, you also earn coins, which you can then use to decorate your own little island. Personally, I have made the executive decision to make my island as chaotic as possible, filling every available square in the most impractical layout. The manor house is guarded with a battalion of these little guys. No unsolicited visitors are getting to my door, thank you very much. Download June's Journey by clicking the link in the description box below. June's Journey is available on iOS and Android devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Now, catch me if you can. Maybe I should go from this way. Okay, that's enough of a thigh workout.